Hi, and welcome to another eBiology Teacher Podcast. I'm Mr. Doc, and today we're talking about environmental factors, specifically those that have to do with matter and energy. So we're going to concentrate more on abiotic factors today. We're going to first try to compare and contrast the flow of matter and energy through an ecosystem. We'll review a little bit about food webs, which we've talked about already. We're also going to talk about how matter, specifically water, carbon, and nitrogen, and to some degree phosphorus, cycle through an ecosystem. We're going to look at the effect that sun has on an ecosystem, both as a biotic factor and an abiotic factor. Obviously, the sun's not living, but it does play a huge role in the biotic way of things. We're going to differentiate between climate and weather, and we're going to explain the impact that climate and weather has. We have a lot of talk about the difference between climate change and blah, blah, blah. Well, it's important to know the difference between the two. And finally, we're going to talk about the process of ecological succession. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. Hi, we're going to kick off today looking at some major laws. Now, I realize this is a biology course, not a physics course, and not a chemistry course, but environmental science is more of a comprehensive thing. So you're going to have a basic understanding of some physical laws in order to understand how the environment works. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. First off, we are going to, let's see here, if I can get this to work. Oh no, my computer's not working. There we go. A quick review includes that everything in the universe is made up of matter. We know that from the law of conservation of matter, which also says that matter can't be created or destroyed, but it can be converted from one form to another. This has some pretty significant implications in ecology. What it really means is that there's never a point in which matter goes away. I mean, when you burn something, for example, it doesn't go away. It goes off in the form of gas, and you have ash, so everything should be accounted for. That also means that in terms of matter, when we eat something, we don't destroy that matter. We break that matter down into its small parts. We assimilate it, or we get rid of it by way of poo or pee, and then we use it. But of course, after we're done with it, which is morbid, it goes back to the environment. So matter is constantly assembled into something, then that's broken down, and that's going to be reassembled into something. So if we think about matter, I think about it as sort of cosmic Legos. You build stuff with them, you take the Legos apart, and you build up something new with it. And there are a variety of different pathways we do that. Energy, on the other hand, follows a similar rule-ish. Okay? The law of thermodynamics, the first law of thermodynamics, says that energy can't be created or destroyed. Okay, so there is a similar law there. It can be converted. However, the second law of thermodynamics throws in a little twist, and it says that the conversion of energy always produces waste energy, which means that no energy exchange is 100% efficient. That means that basically not all energy is created the same. There are certain forms of energy that we find useful, and there are certain forms of energy that we really can't harness. As we convert energy from one form to another, we convert some of that energy into a useful form, and then we convert some of it into that less useful form that we really can't use. So there's never going to be a 100% energy exchange. And that much is demonstrated by food webs and food chains, because as we exchange energy, more specifically with trophic pyramids, we're going to lose about 90% of the energy at each level. So while energy can't be created or destroyed, it also is sort of degraded over time as it goes through these conversions, which means that energy must constantly flow through an ecosystem, whereas matter will constantly cycle within an ecosystem. So if we look at this at a fundamental level, the carbon atoms, the whatever atoms that make you up, ultimately come back in the form of other molecules that end up going into other things, which go into other things, which means if you think about it, you're technically probably part dinosaur, which is, kind of cool. Whatever. All right, so let's move forward. Biogeochemical cycles, or biochemical cycles, explain these sort of predicted patterns by which major types of matter go through. Most of these we're talking about elemental things like carbon and nitrogen. But probably one of the most influential cycles is the water cycle, which is sometimes called the hydrologic cycle. And there are specific things that occur in each one of these steps, or each one of these cycles, that are unique to that form of matter. For example, the water cycle regulates basically the most important process in living things that's inorganic. We're looking at converting liquid into gas water, which basically, if we look at this water is so key. Water is the reason why we're here. Okay, water. If there weren't water on this planet, we wouldn't be here. So thank you, water. So let's agree on that and move on. All right. Uh-oh. I went somewhere else that I didn't mean to go. Here, there we go. All right. So water can evaporate, which you see here, and goes up into the atmosphere. Now, it can also undergo transpiration, which is the process basically of evaporation from plants. Condensation occurs when gas water or water vapor goes back into its liquid form. Now, that happens and we see clouds. So when you're seeing clouds, you're seeing a variety of different things going on. But really what's happening here is the water is coming back in a liquid form and just kind of staying there. When there's too much water in the atmosphere, it will come down in the form of precipitation. Now when it does that, it's going to hit a surface, it's going to run off, and then we're also going to see seepage. Seepage goes into the ground, and that creates a groundwater. We also have uptake, which is what happens when plants take this water. They pull it up into their roots. But ultimately, it's going to find its way back to another reservoir of water like an ocean, a lake, a river, or a stream. And then it's going to continue. So that's kind of the water cycle. And as you can see, once it makes it back to these reservoirs, it can undergo evaporation, transpiration, or a variety of those other things that we talked about. All right? Now, let's take a look at another cycle. This is the carbon cycle. Carbon cycle puts carbon in the atmosphere and takes it out. So carbon basically is put into the atmosphere by a couple of different things. Number one, respiration, which we and all other organisms for the most part do. We process glucose and we produce carbon dioxide, and so that goes in the atmosphere, right? But we also have volcanic eruptions, which produce quite a bit of carbon dioxide. And we also have a variety of different fossil fuel burning mechanisms which produce copious amounts of carbon dioxide. Now, the carbon dioxide can be removed by the atmosphere mostly through the biological process of photosynthesis. So even though we're putting tons and tons of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, the main way by which carbon dioxide is removed from the atmosphere is photosynthesis. And before you think about just trees, keep in mind the majority of the planet is covered by water. That water is infested with algae, and algae is actually responsible for more of photosynthesis than all the land plants on the globe combined. So keep that in mind. Now, once we have photosynthesis occurring, we're going to lock that carbon into usable particles, usually glucose or other carbohydrates. And then what's going to happen is the plants are going to be fed upon by animals or other organisms, and then those organisms are going to respire and put that back into the atmosphere. They can also die and decompose, in which case the decomposition of the material causes the carbon to go back into the soil. It can be uptake, or in large part when something dies and decomposes, the carbon escapes in the form of gas. This is happening both on terrestrial or land areas, and it's also happening quite a bit in the ocean. So while those food webs, the marine food web and the terrestrial food web actually behave in kind of different ways, ultimately they're the same thing when it comes to the carbon cycle. They're taking carbon out of the atmosphere, using it, and then putting it back, and then taking it out, and then, it's a cycle, which is what we knew. All right, next up is the nitrogen cycle. Nitrogen is in the atmosphere. It makes up the majority of our atmosphere, but here's the catch with the nitrogen. We can't use it. You're literally surrounded by it. It's everywhere. It makes up the majority of our atmosphere, but in its current form, you can't use it. And by the way, you need it because nitrogen is in nitrogenous bases, which we talked about in DNA. The amino group, an amino acid, which deals with protein, is an NH4, so we need it there. So proteins and DNA, those are two pretty important things, if I'm not mistaken. So we need nitrogen. But since we can't use it, there's a process by which it has to be fixed, and it's called nitrogen fixation. Certain bacteria, and in some cases lightning, can actually convert nitrogen into usable forms like nitrates and nitrites. Now, when that occurs, the nitrates and nitrites are brought up by plants, so we uptake them. They produce their wares and organisms eat them, and then we use it. So basically what happens is we have this atmospheric nitrogen. we have either nitrogen fixation by bacteria or lightning, which then occurs, we end up taking it up into plants, and then consumers eat it, and then consumers return it either by decomposition or excretion. And when we talk about excretion, we're talking about that PPE and poo-poo again, right? All right, so this also occurs in aquatic ecosystems, and remember, this is primarily biologically managed. Okay, and let me go back here for just a second. We're talking about matter cycles, so it seems like we're talking about chemistry, but keep in mind these cycles are really regulated by living factors. The living components of the ecosystem are what's causing these things to constantly regenerate, going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. So we really can't separate this into an abiotic system. It's regulated and regulates biotic systems. So they are completely connected. They're completely intertwined. Keep in mind that waste is going to contain a lot of these things, especially nitrogen. So as organisms die and decompose, or as they produce waste, that's going to have nitrogen in it. And of course, we know that nitrogen is essential for plant growth. So there are some ways in which we can use plant waste to help animal waste to help plants grow. We take them apart and put them together. You see what I'm saying? That's why manure makes a good fertilizer, because basically you're just packing a bunch of nitrogen and phosphorus and other things into the soil that the plants can use. In other words, you're helping the cycle move a little quicker. All right, and of course there's a downside of that if you use too much, but we'll get to that later. Next up, we're going to talk about the sun. Now, obviously the sun is an abiotic factor, but keep in mind that the sun is really the single largest driving factor behind the cycles, because air and water move, and they move because of differential heating. In other words, the Earth is never the same temperature all the way around. So as there are differences in temperature, air and water masses are going to move from hot to cold, and as air and water move, they create air currents and water currents, and that's some of the reason why the atmosphere is constantly changing. It's also the reason why we have weather and climate. So it's important to note that the sun is really the biggest driving force, okay? If the Earth were a car, the sun is our engine, because it really provides the energy, not only biologically by way of photosynthesis, but also climatically, because as we heat air and water, currents move, and then of course as currents move, we end up with wind and rain and stuff like that. And so the sun is really a big player when it comes to ecology. Now, there is a difference between climate and weather. Climate really is the long-term average year-to-year conditions, including temperature and precipitation. Climate really is determined by the latitude, and that really should say latitude, by the way, not longitude. It's also the angle of and the amount of direct sunlight exposure, the elevation, meaning how high up in the atmosphere the landmass is, and how close you are to water. So your climate really is determined by where you are on the globe, and like I said, that should say latitude, not longitude. It's the amount or angle of sunlight. It's the elevation and the proximity. This kind of gives us a point to talk about. A lot of times you hear the land of the midnight sun when people talk about the Arctic and Alaska, where it's like light for 6 months out of the year, and you think, well, wow, it would have to get really hot. Yes, they have a long duration of time in which they're exposed to sunlight, but the sunlight isn't directly on that spot. That's why the equator is so warm. You see, the equator has constant direct exposure to the sun's rays. So as the Earth starts to round off, the sun sort of hits indirectly. So even though you may have a lot of light in an area, it doesn't mean that area is automatically going to be warm. Okay, and obviously as we go up in latitude, we're getting further and further away from the sun. Now, weather, on the other hand, is the average, or is the day-to-day conditions of precipitation and temperature in a specific location. Weather is determined by how air moves, how water moves, and basically the time of year. Keep in mind that the Earth exists on this sort of this axis that moves back and forth. So if we are closer to the sun, it's going to be warmer, and if we're further away from the sun, it's going to be cooler, and that's just sort of the way of things. So keep that in mind as you're looking through why do we have seasons? Well, there's some times where our part of the globe is closer to the sun and we're going to be warmer, and there are times where our part of the globe is further away from the sun and we're going to be cooler. All right? Now, organisms require a narrow range of conditions in order to survive. That is simple. But those conditions include temperatures, precipitation, the amount of water. So that means that climate directly controls not only how matter cycles and how energy goes through an ecosystem, but it also determines what lives where. In other words, the sun says you can live here, but you can't. That's why we don't see polar bears running around Indiana, and we don't see a whole bunch of iguanas either, because it would be too cold for one and too hot for the other, and so forth on. So we're going to constantly have climate determining what succeeds there. But really it's less about the animals and more about the plants, because you see, plants are going to grow in an area, and since they are the producers of the food web, the things that need those plants are going to live where the plants are. It's very simple. You're going to live where the stuff you need is or grows. Right? So as climate determines these bands of where certain vegetation can grow, then the animals are sure to follow. And guess what? If you're an animal and you live in a place where you don't have the plant you need, then you're not going to live there very long. All right? Now, organisms often have adaptations or similarities based on that region because there are certain things that allow them to be more successful in that area. That explains why organisms that live in the desert often look similar even though they're unrelated. For example, you see these lizards that look kind of like a cactus. Well, it's certainly not related, but there are certain things about that structure that make them better suited for that environment. We'll get to that when we talk about evolution. All right? This also establishes what we call biomes. And biomes are defined by their climate and the types of organisms that call it home. For example, broadleaf fruit-producing plants need lots of warmth and sunlight, which is why they're more common in tropical areas. But conifers, or pine trees, on the other hand, can withstand bitter cold temperatures and therefore often found in colder environments. So you see, animals depend directly or indirectly on plants, so animals that depend on conifers are going to live in coniferous forests, whereas organisms that need lots of fruit are probably going to live in more tropical or subtropical areas. The moral of the story here is the sun's demand. You know what I'm saying? All right. Now, if we look at this map, these are biomes, and I do want you to notice something. You've got these long bands of similar colors, and they're all in the same general area. For example, this green band right here is tropical rainforest. They're all found right near the equator. The reason is simple. Biomes are determined by their climate. Climate is determined by latitude on the globe. So, of course, they're going to exist in bands, which explains why if there's a desert in, say, South America, there's probably a desert in the same general area on the African continent or something like that. Okay. Now, this takes us to succession. Because climate is a large part and will determine what will grow in an area, if there is a change in that area, if there's a disturbance, and it causes the area to go through massive changes, eventually, because climate is such a huge driving force by what grows and is where, then what's ultimately going to happen is that the area is going to return to the way it was. Because what determined the way it was in the first place? The climate. Let me rephrase that. If climate really is what determines the way an area looks and the way those cycles behave, if those are disturbed, and then they're allowed to go back, they're probably going to come back the same way because the climate's still the same, right? Which explains why if we clear an entire forest and we just let it go, ultimately a forest very similar to the one that we cleared will probably come back in its place. And that's a process called succession. But there's two different kinds of succession. The first kind is primary succession, and this happens when there's no soil, okay? Primarily, we're talking about volcanic eruptions or when bare rock is exposed due to extreme erosion, or if we have glaciers melting and new rock is exposed at that point. Basically, what happens during primary succession is we first have to start with the formation of soil. Once we have soil, which takes a huge amount of time, we can then start very minor plants. So basically what happens in primary succession is bare rock is going to be covered by like mosses and lichens and maybe bacteria or algae. That's going to die and decompose, and that's going to form a very basic soil. And then as time goes, rock will start to break up, and it'll break into smaller pieces and smaller pieces and smaller pieces. So primary succession, first of all, doesn't happen extremely often in settled areas. But when it does, it takes a really long time because you got to form that soil. If you've ever been to Hawaii, you can be on a beach and there's plants and stuff everywhere, and literally next door there's this field that's just black rock. It's because it's a volcanic eruption, and that lava has formed new land there. Well, now that land will ultimately look like the beach that you're standing on. It just takes time, right? Because that rock is going to be broken down, just like the rock you're standing on was broken down. It's going to get turned into soil, and then plants are going to come like the plants that are around you. And eventually, thousands of years later, that's going to look like the place that you were standing. Okay. Now, secondary succession is a little simpler in that any disturbance leaves the soil. Okay, so we're not talking about new land being formed. Now we're talking about soil being left behind, like a forest fire or a pond drying up or something like that. Either way, what's going to end up happening is you're going to start with very basic plants. Now, here we have primary succession occurring. We have this bare rock with lichens and mosses starting to form here, then more rudimentary plants and grasses here, and then ultimately we have more and more complex trees and stuff like that. That's really the process of succession. And notice I haven't mentioned animals. Well, remember, animals depend on producers, so the plants are really going to be the first ones to settle in an area. The first ones to settle in an area are going to be pioneer species. These are species that really like that area and are really kind of live anywhere. All right, so that's your discussion on matter cycles and succession and biomes. I hope it's helped, and I'll see you again hopefully soon.